Mr. Nut.
Nut, 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 nut. Nut.
So here we have it, Mr. Nutz. Mr. Nutz is a mascot platformer available on SNES, Genesis, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Developed by Ocean Software, who you might recognize for their prevalence as a creator of licensed computer games in the 80s, as well as their strange home console games in the 90s, of which Mr. Nutz is one of. It's mostly considered a hidden gem today, but it was popular enough to make it onto the SNES Mini back in 2017. Like many other games of the era, the story begins not in-game, but in the manual. From there, you'll learn of an abominable Yeti threatening to freeze the Earth and bring about a new ice age. Obviously, Mr. Nutz is having none of that shit, and sets off to go kick the Yeti's ass. Mr. Nutz keeps its gameplay simple. It's an exploration-focused 2D platformer. Simply make your way to the end of each act or journey to progress, and once you beat all of the journeys in a stage, you'll fight a boss. Defeat the boss and you'll be sent to the next stage. When platforming, you'll be hunting down coins and defeating enemies to drive your score as high as possible. Once you complete a stage, you'll be given some bonus points depending on how well you did, including a massive bonus and an extra life if you manage to collect every single coin. I never did this for any of the stages I played. Mr. Nutz doesn't have a time limit, so you're encouraged to explore every nook and cranny of the game at your leisure. The titular squirrel has a pretty simple moveset. Left and right to move, down to crouch, B or A to jump, and hold X to run. Pressing Y gets you this pointing animation, which when properly stocked up on acorns is his Nutz attack, which functions as a simple projectile. If you hit Y while crouching, you'll get a tail attack. And I have to say, Mr. Nutz does not feel that bad to control, to my surprise. I think my experience with Bubsy has led to me being skeptical of random mascot platformers, where ground movement tends to feel like you're covered in oil, and air movement feels like you're flying a plane with no wings. Nutz's movement isn't perfect, mind you, like the difference between running and walking is minute, and with running granting you more responsive air control, you pretty much always want to be holding down run for the sake of precision. Regardless, it still feels a little slippery, and oddly enough, I almost feel like it was intentional. Or, at the very least, they designed around it. Because looking at your default moveset, the controls make the jumps feel a little difficult to make, and the tail attack has a pathetically short range, and can only be used when standing still. I think the weaknesses of these attacks provides a small but engaging form of resource management. You see, there's a limited number of acorns in each stage, and they don't respawn, so you'll never find yourself with a massive stockpile of acorns. This leads to a constant game of weighing your options to try and figure out when it's worth it to use your stronger but resource-limited attack or your weaker default moves. This all shapes up to Mr. Nutz having decent game feel. Nothing outstanding, but it doesn't feel like it's fighting you, which unfortunately tends to be the case with random platformers like this. As for levels, like I mentioned earlier, this game has a pretty heavy focus on exploration. Levels are vast, with all sorts of goodies like HP, lives, and power-ups spread throughout. Something I enjoy is that the game doesn't always follow the go right to progress rule of platformers. The levels often double back on themselves, creating these multi-layer lasagna type levels, which gives the game a nice sense of scale. Another thing I like is that they'll often hide secret items or alternate paths in areas you can only reach by jumping on strings of enemies. It's very rewarding and feels similar to something like Donkey Kong Country. Now, the sheer size does come with drawbacks. The individual acts can be a bit too large, and dying will always send you back to the beginning of whatever screen you're on. Zero checkpoints and health being scarce can make the game feel pretty punishing if you aren't careful. And being cautious isn't always easy. For starters, the camera isn't the best. It lets you get a bit too close to the edges of the screen when traveling vertically, leading to seeing what's ahead while climbing upwards pretty difficult. It also likes throwing these semi-leaps of faith at you. It's never to the point that I felt like it was total bullshit, but I did have to edge over some gaps to make sure I was actually jumping to solid ground on multiple occasions. Enemy placement is another issue I have. Most of the enemies aren't that big of a deal. Since they're so big, you can hit them with any attack in your arsenal. But the small one-block large enemies are just a pain. Jumping on them is pretty difficult, and they're often too low to hit with an acorn, so you really just have to hope you can meet them face to face and tail swipe them. Also, this game has a lot of irritating flying enemies. These birds have pain in the ass tracking, these birds throw the most annoyingly large and long-lasting projectiles known to man, and there's just so many bees. I will admit that the sheer number of enemies they're willing to place on screen at one time was pretty damn funny. Now how about those bosses? There's 6 main levels in Mr. Nutz, and 1 boss for each. Honestly, these are the low points of the game. They range from boring to downright frustrating. You can only damage them by jumping on them, so you really should save your acorns for their minions. Stuff like Mr. Spider and the Witch are fairly simple. Dodge their minions and jump on them when you get the chance. The giant octopus is where it starts to get silly. The whole fight is underwater. His fish missiles are hard to dodge, and his jellyfish minions instantly home in on your location. Combine this with having to jump on the octopus while underwater makes the whole fight awkward and unpleasant. Now, the giant and the clown are where the bosses get really annoying. The giant has long periods of invincibility where you just have to dodge attacks until it pokes its head out for you, which is annoying, but he doesn't take that long, so he's okay, I guess. Plus he gets bonus silly points. The clown, on the other hand, has way too much health, forces you to dodge his flips and the stupid pie attack until he finally releases 3 of his heads, which upon being defeated will deal 1 point of damage. This fight sucks so bad. And the final boss against the Yeti isn't much better. The arena is stupidly small, with 2 bottomless pits on either side of your main platform. He attacks by throwing snowflakes, attempting to blow you off the platform, and jumping on you. Oh, by the way, the whole arena is icy, making it difficult to move precisely at all. This boss put a really sour taste in my mouth right at the end of the game. His attacks are really difficult to avoid, with one of them resulting in instant death. And once I got him low enough, I just damage boosted through him so I wouldn't have to waste another single second in that boss fight. The bosses in general suck. They have interesting designs, but not much else. Speaking of designs, this game has a surprisingly nice visual style. The backgrounds and environments are very well done. I love the parallax backgrounds of Stage 2, and Stage 6 in particular. The only area its visuals falter for me are the character sprites. Mr. Nutz looks a little puffy? I'm not sure how to describe it. He looks like he's having an allergic reaction. He also doesn't really match the box art that closely for some reason. Also, some of the enemies look a little bit strange, like they don't quite all fit together in the same art style. Although there is some very surprising attention to detail, like the way this cushion depresses as you walk along it, or the way sponges bob in the water. Despite my reservations, the game's graphics definitely have some love put into them. Now, for the music. It wasn't anything as crazy rock hard like Plock's music, but it was still really pleasant, and it just oozed charm. I really had a good time listening to this game's OST. My favorite track is the Arctic track you're listening to right now. To summarize, most of the time, Mr. Nutz is a fun game, but at the same time, I think almost any other 2D platformer of the era has more innovative mechanics and interesting gameplay. So much of Mr. Nutz trends towards being just good enough. Excluding the bosses, I wouldn't say any of it is bad or even average, but it doesn't have any real wow factor to it. It doesn't have the exciting movement of Sonic, the amazing music of Mega Man, or the all-around appeal of Mario. It's the kind of game you play and enjoy when there's absolutely nothing else on hand. But if you saw something you think you'd enjoy in this video, I would still recommend giving it a shot. Just don't buy it physically on SNES.